Imagine you are a soldier in the ancient Persian military around 500 BC. You are sent on a mission to Egypt, but en route, you and all your buddies are lost in a sandstorm. This was not a small scouting party of a dozen soldiers. It was not a few hundreds in a company or a detachment of 1,000. No, you are serving in the army of Cambyses II as just one out of 50,000 soldiers who all disappeared. Even to this day, some people are still searching for your remains in the deserts of northeastern Africa. Now, Cambyses II was a historical figure, and his campaigns against the Egyptians are documented, though this specific instance may not be 100% true. But it's quite expected that not all campaigns will succeed, and not all expeditions sent out will return home safely. So let's talk about lost expeditions. If you ever find yourself in distress, do you think altruism or egoism is better if you want to survive? Well, let's compare two different expeditions and their fate to find out. During 1864, the two ships Invercold and Grafton would be lost at sea while out on their respective expeditions. The Invercold was the larger one, with a displacement of 1,100 tons and a crew of 25 men, with a mission to relocate to Peru. While the Grafton, being a smaller ship of only 56 tons and carrying a crew of 5, was tasked with surveying some uninhabited islands south of New Zealand for mining deposits. On the face of it, these two expeditions could not be more different from one another, but they would still meet the same fate. Both ships would run aground and leave their crews stranded. But this is where the differences start picking up again. The crew of the smaller Grafton, who had run aground in January, focused on cooperation and helping each other out, maintaining organization and structure of a crew even if their ship was lost, caring for the weak and working towards a common goal. The crew of the larger Invercold, having been shipwrecked in May, would have a very different outcome. Cohesion quickly broke down between the 19 men who had made it to shore, with different groups focusing on their own survival. A sick crew member was left to die alone, and testimonies tell of acts of cannibalism. Despite the crew of the Grafton being stranded a lot longer than the men of the Invercold, the survival rate was quite the opposite. Of the fractionalized Invercold crew of 19, only 3 would ultimately make it back home after having been stranded for a year, while the altruistic and well-organized members of the Grafton, after having been stranded for a year and a half, would all make it back home. More factors could probably be taken into account as to why one of the groups fared better than the other, but one factor that would not make a difference is the environment. To compare these two expeditions is fitting not only because their shipwrecks coincided in time, but also for the crazy circumstance that they had stranded on opposite sides of the same island. And despite the so-called Auckland Island having been their shared home for a year, none of the crew members ever encountered each other. Oh, also right next to Auckland Island, there's a small island called Disappointment Island, and it kind of looks like Iceland, I think. So I just felt like sharing that as well. Overcoming an obstacle requires effort, and the bigger the obstacle, the more resources and effort is required. But sometimes, not even the biggest player will be able to overcome it. Probably the most famous expedition of all is that of when Columbus sailed west to find an alternative route to East Asia. As you all know, he didn't make it to India, but instead discovered a new landmass we today call America. This in turn caused a new rush of expeditions to explore what riches could be found in this so-called New World. But the original goal, finding an alternative route to India, never went away. If you think about it, the most well-known expedition of them all, was actually a failure. But I didn't want to talk about Columbus's voyage to America, but rather how the continent's tectonic indecency to spread out from north to south severely hampered the possibility of establishing an alternative route to Asia. Finding a way to go around the continent didn't take too long to discover. Ferdinand Magellan was the first to circumnavigate the world in 1520 by sailing past the southern tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego. But having to sail all the way down the south of the Americas wasn't much of an improvement compared to sailing around Africa to reach Asia, an achievement actually not completed until after Columbus's first voyage to America. Over the next couple of hundreds of years, explorers would slowly map out the coastline of America to see what possibilities existed to somehow pass the continent further north. A straight through could not be found, and by the 1800s it was clear that what was required was to find a kind of a northwest passage, a hypothetical sea lane north of Canada that could link Europe and Asia together over a much shorter distance. In 1845, the Royal Navy decided to make a big push to find the Northwest Passage. After all, there was no wars going on, and British officers were keen on upholding the idea of ruling the waves. The Navy equipped 2 large warships and assigned John Franklin as the commander of the expedition. This was far from a radical experiment based on theoretical assumptions of the Arctic. This would be Franklin's 3rd expedition into the Arctic. The ships, the HMS Terror and Erebus, had already seen service on previous Arctic expeditions. This would just be another step in a methodic approach by the reigning superpower of the world to push maritime boundaries. But the pack ice and freezing temperature of the north would not yield to what the greatest empire of history could muster. The Franklin expedition would enter the archipelago in 1845 and would remain at Beechey Island during the winter, awaiting favorable conditions to venture further west and actually scout for a potential passage. In the summer of 1846, they could continue their journey until September that year, when they made it as far as King William Island. That's where both of their ships got stuck in ice. What might surprise you is that getting stuck in ice is not as catastrophic as it might sound. The HMS Terror had been stuck in ice during a previous expedition. Standard procedure is to wait for warmer weather and for the ice to just thaw, freeing the ship. There are 2 dangers with the unpredictable climate of the Arctic. One is that the weather can sometimes shift rapidly. The other is that sometimes it doesn't. We don't know the exact events that took place after the ships had been frozen in ice. The logbook and documentation are sparse. But it is assumed that they remained locked for 2 years without the ice thawing during the summers. With many members of the crew having died, including its commander John Franklin, the men who were left alive began a march south, crossing land and ice, trying to walk back to civilization. Their goal was British military outposts in northern Canada. Some traces have been found, and perhaps some of the crew made it all the way to the northern shore of Canada before ultimately succumbing to the climate and sickness. None of the crew survived the expedition. We know today that the route the expedition was on would not be passable due to the shallow depths. Some 60 years later, the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen and his crew would be the first to make it through the Northwest Passage using a much smaller ship. A different route that is deep enough for larger ships exists, and it took another 50 years before the SS Manhattan, an American tanker, completed the first voyage carrying 1 barrel of oil, to prove that it was at least possible for commercial ships to utilize the Northwest Passage, although requiring the support of an icebreaker the whole way through. Still to this day, the Northwest Passage has not proved commercially viable as a shipping lane. But maybe as the ice sheets pull back, making passage more easy, we will see a lot more container ships and tankers pass north of Canada. Perhaps Parry Channel, as it's called, will become the next highly contested sea lane, much like the Gulf of Aden, the Suez Canal, or the Straits of Malacca. Before setting out on an expedition, you should ask yourself, what do you want to be remembered by? Your worldly accomplishments or your virtues? I mentioned that Roald Amundsen and his crew was the first to sail through the Northwest Passage. You might recognize his name from a different polar achievement, that of being the first to reach the South Pole. On the 14th of December 1911, Roald and his expedition reached the geographic South Pole as the first people to ever do so, and planted the Norwegian flag to mark their achievement. And they left the site after 3 days. The flag would sit completely alone in the desolate, icy landscape of Antarctica for about 30 days before another group of people showed up. This was the members of the competing Terra Nova expedition led by Robert Falcon Scott, representing Britain. His diary has provided the details we know of their expedition. Both parties had endured an almost 3-month-long march on foot over ice and through mountain ranges, supported only by dog sleds to reach 90 degrees south. The British Terra Nova expedition had already run in with Amundsen's expedition and knew about the competition. But in a time before modern communications, it would have been impossible for the British to know that the goal of reaching the South Pole was lost. But seeing that other red, white and blue cross flag removed all doubts. The thing when you undertake a 90-day march south through a hostile environment is that the only logical next step for you is to take another 90-day march through a hostile environment north, perhaps now feeling it was all for nothing. The first 3 weeks went by without much deviation, but then everything started to fall apart. Frostbite and physical wounds from the journey had started to weaken the members. Edgar Evans was the first to die. He had slipped and hit his head on the ice. Initially believed to be able to carry on as the normally self-reliant person the team knew him as, the other party members noticed a shift in his personality, most likely as a result of brain injury, requiring more and more assistance to keep up. One evening, he collapsed in the tent and did not get up the next morning when the expedition had to continue. He is believed to have died of a brain hemorrhage. As the remaining 4 members continued north, the diary of Scott described the top layer of ice as becoming like sand, making it hard to pull the sleds. Given the limited resources, any possibility of making it back to the coast required a minimum speed of travel. It did not help that another member, Lawrence Oates, had suffered such severe frostbites that his hands and feet were barely usable. But still sound of mind, most likely realizing that it would be impossible for them to make it back if the rest of the team had to pull him along. On the 16th of March, after 2 months of marching north, and having set up a tent for the night to take shelter from a blizzard and temperature of 40 degrees below, Oates stood up, walked towards the exit of the tent, and turned to his fellow expedition members. "I'm just going outside and maybe sometime." He then stepped outside, closed the tent behind him, and was never seen again. The painting in the thumbnail depicts this event, and it was painted by John Charles Dolman in 1913 and is called "A Very Gallant Gentleman." The regiment Oates served in as an officer still commemorates the 16th of March in memory of his actions. Unfortunately, his deeds only survived through the recovery of Scott's diary. Similar to the weather around the North Pole, the weather around the South Pole can shift quickly, overwhelming an expedition and remaining in place for longer than expected. The last 3 members only managed to continue another 4 days before being confined to their tents, weakened by frostbite and scurvy, and besieged by the blizzard. They all died about a week later. So, if you feel like venturing out on an expedition, make sure to keep a cool head. If you get shipwrecked, stick together. If you manage to find a route, accept that it might take long before it is of any use. And regardless of how lost a cause may seem, always uphold good moral virtues. That might be what the world remembers you by. Thanks for watching.